The Virginia Free Press, Volume 70, Volume 16, New Series, Charlestown, Jefferson County, West Virginia, Saturday, June 4th, 1881, number 42. Wizard Clip, a Legend. This is the name which for many years was popularly given to a town of some 800 inhabitants, legally incorporated as Smithfield, and now known as Middleway. At the date of the transactions hereinafter referred to, which occurred near a century ago, it was situated within the limits of Berkeley County, State of Virginia, but is now embraced in the County of Jefferson, West Virginia. Its location is about 7 miles from Charlestown, the county seat of Jefferson, and 13 from Martinsburg. It would be unpardonable, in a work devoted to West Virginia antiquities, to omit all mention of a remarkable legend, which for so many years cast a glamour over the fortunes of that little town. Undoubtedly, the story in many of its details can find but little credence in this skeptical age, and yet, when we refer to the general belief of that community in the marvelous facts of this narrative, when we consider how many pure, able, pious, and distinguished clergymen gave countenance to its extraordinary details, and above all, when we know the fact that for half a century the alleged butchery of this tale obliterated the legal appellation of a town and gave it a name characterized by the incidents to which we are about to refer, it must be conceded that it is worthy of some historical notice, even if we are compelled to class it among the medieval delusions of the human mind. The earliest written record of these remarkable spiritual manifestations was from the pen of Reverend Demetrius A. Golitsyn, a prince of the Russian Empire, who was subsequently become a priest of the Roman Catholic Church. His memoir was prepared in 1797, and in the same year there are letters to the same effect still preserved of Mrs. Anastasia McSherry, wife of Richard McSherry, a lady of great intelligence and of fervent and exalted piety. Numerous other memoirs have been written upon the same subject since that time, which will be noticed at the close of this article. The story as extracted from these publications is briefly as follows. Adam Livingston, becoming dissatisfied with his residence in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, determined to remove to the state of Virginia, and carried his purpose into effect by the purchase of a house and lot in Smithfield and 70 acres contiguous thereto. This was about the year 1790. He had the reputation of being an honest and industrious farmer of fair intelligence, and brought with him his wife and a family of 3 sons and 4 daughters, of whom Eve and Catherine are the only daughters, and John and Henry the only sons, who are referred to in any of these memoirs. Livingston continued to reside there without attracting any particular notice until 1794, when a stranger of middle age and of respectable appearance made a visit to the place, and was received as a boarder in his house. In a few days after the arrival of this traveler he was taken sick, and, as his illness became more threatening, he called Livingston to his bedside, informed him that he was a Catholic, and inquired of him if there was not a priest somewhere in the neighborhood whose services he could procure, should his malady prove fatal, which he had reason then to fear it would. Livingston, who was an intensely bigoted member of the Lutheran Church, very gruffly replied to him, quote, that he knew of no priest in that neighborhood, and if there was one, he should never pass the threshold of his door, unquote. The dying man repeated his entreaties for the spiritual aid of a Catholic priest, but Livingston was inexorable, and refused to countenance his request. The stranger died, his name unknown to his host, and there being nothing among his papers to throw any light upon his history. On the night of his death, Livingston employed a man of the name of Jacob Forster to sit up with the corpse, but so soon as the candles were lighted in the chamber of the dead, after giving a weak and flickering light, they went out, and the room was left in darkness. They were relighted several times, supposing it to result from some remediable defect in the article, but with the same result. Livingston then brought 2 candles into the room, which he had been using in his own family, which were a third burnt down, and which he knew to be good. But so soon as they were placed in the same room with the corpse, they became immediately extinguished. This so alarmed Forster that he abandoned his vigils and left the house. On the next day, as the corpse was being carried to the grave, one of the pallbearers stumbled, the coffin came to the ground with great violence, the lid fell off, when apparently fresh blood was seen oozing from the nose of the corpse. This led to a medical examination, when the 3 doctors of the town pronounced life extinct, and the corpse a proper subject for burial. 50 years ago, the grave of the stranger could be distinctly pointed out. On the night succeeding the burial, the peace of Livingston was much disturbed by the apparent sound of horses galloping around his house. He frequently arose during the night, which was a beautiful moonlit night, to satisfy his mind, and while he could distinctly hear the tramp of steeds, he could see nothing to assure him that it was anything more than a figment of his own imagination. In about a week afterwards, his barn was burnt, and his cattle all died. The crockery-ware in his house, without any visible agency, was thrown upon the floor and broken. His money disappeared. The heads of his turkeys and chickens dropped off, and chunks of burning wood would leap from the fireplace several feet upon the floor, endangering the building unless promptly replaced. Soon the annoyances, which were then destroying his peace, assumed a new form. The sound of a large pair of shears could be distinctly heard in his house, clipping, in the form of half-moons and other curious figures, his blankets, sheets, counterpanes, boots, saddles, clothing, etc. This was not done all in one night, but the operation of clipping continued for upwards of 3 months, a small portion of it only being done at a time, but the inexorable shears never being silent 24 hours at a time. By the time these strange proceedings were spread throughout the country for 30 miles around and attracted in an especial manner the curiosity of the citizens of Smithfield, one witness testifies as to seeing a boot, which as it stood upon the floor, quote, seemed whole and entire, but lifted by the top, lengthened into a long spiral slip, a state to which it had been brought in an instant, when on the leg of the wearer, by invisible means, unquote. An old Presbyterian lady of Martinsburg testified, quote, that having heard of the clipping that was going on at Livingston's, to satisfy her curiosity she went to Livingston's house. Before entering the door she took from her head her new black silk cap, wrapped it up in her silk handkerchief, and put it in her pocket to save it from being clipped. After a while she stepped out again to go home, and having drawn the handkerchief out of her pocket and opened it, found her cap cut into narrow ribbons, unquote. Many of the similar phenomena are stated and testified to by many witnesses. The long continuance of this mysterious clipping had now aroused the country for many miles around. 3 daring and adventurous young men from Winchester came to Smithfield, declaring their utter unbelief in the reports, and offered to sleep in the house all night, and to face the devil himself if he was the author of these doings. But so soon as they became comfortably seated in the house, a large stone was seen to proceed from the fireplace and to whirl around the floor with great velocity, when they took to their heels and made their escape. The condition of poor Livingston by this time became deplorable. He had lost much rest, and his imagination was so worked upon by his nocturnal visitor that his health began visibly to fail. He applied to 3 professed conjurers, but their incantations were all in vain. Shortly after this, Livingston had a dream. He thought he was climbing a high mountain, and had great difficulty in the ascent. He had to labor hard, catching at roots and bushes, and moving forward slowly by their aid. When reaching the summit, he saw an imposing personage, dressed, quote, in robes, close quote, as he described it. After contemplating for some time the person in his view, he heard a voice saying, quote, "This is the man who can relieve you," unquote. His wife heard him groaning in his sleep, and she awoke him. Whereupon he communicated to her his dream, and said he did not know of any minister who wore robes, but he would make inquiry in the morning. The result of these inquiries led him to visit an Episcopal minister, who then resided in Winchester, but he derived very little satisfaction from this visit and returned home, much disappointed. He was then advised to see the McSherry family, who were Roman Catholics, who resided upon a fine estate called Retirement, about 1 mile east of Leetown, at a place the priest was often in the habit of stopping, while discharging his spiritual functions in that neighborhood. Late in the evening of that same day, Mrs. McSherry saw a man coming to her house. She met him at the gate, when he told her that he wanted, quote, to see the priest, close quote. She informed him that the priest was not at her house, but there would be church in Shepherdstown the following Sunday, when he would have an opportunity of seeing him. Mr. and Mrs. McSherry, in company with Mr. Mingini, went to church on the appointed day, and there they saw the man who had inquired for the priest, and who proved to be Livingston. As the priest appeared at the altar, dressed in his canonicals, Livingston became to be perfectly overcome. He wept bitterly, exclaimed loud enough to be heard by the small congregation, quote, "This is the man I saw in my dream. He is the one that the voice told me would relieve me from my troubles," close quote. When the service was over, he promptly called on the priest and told him his sad story. But the priest, the Reverend Dennis Cahill, laughed at him and told him it must be some of his neighbors who were plaguing him, and that he must go home and keep a strict watch for them. Richard McSherry and Joseph Mingini, who were present at the interview, were much moved by the old man's tears and tried to comfort him. After much urgent persuasion, Father Cahill, accompanied by Mr. McSherry and Mr. Mingini, agreed to visit Livingston's house, and to inquire into the strange transactions which he had related. They found his story corroborated, not only by the family, but by most of the persons with whom they conversed in Smithfield. Father Cahill resorted to the remedy of sprinkling his house with holy water, which did not, however, exorcise the troublesome visitor from the building, but it was followed by a deposit of the money on the door, the money on the door-sill, which had been previously taken away. The strange clipping still continuing after that time, it was determined by Father Cahill to have Mass celebrated in the house, which was done, and Livingston was relieved from all the annoyances of his ghostly visitor. From that time until he left Virginia, he had frequent communications with the spiritual world, and many facts are related where those communications were realized in a very striking manner. But, as these throw no light upon the simple historical fact, which is the purpose of this article to elucidate, no further references need to be made to them. From this time, and for half a century afterwards, this town was universally known as Wizard's Clip, or Clip, Smithfield being alone recognized as its name in relations to the post office department. This legend, as before remarked, has given rise to numerous memoirs and publications. Besides those of Reverend Mr. Galitzin and Mrs. Anastasia McSherry, before referred to. Another was prepared in 1817 by the Reverend Thomas Mulady, who then visited the place in company with the Reverend Anthony Coleman. The story figures in a novel called Alban, A Tale of the New World, published by G.P. Putnam in 1851. A full account of it may be seen also in the St. Louis Leader, published by J.V. Huntington, in the Catholic Mirror by the Reverend Louis Obermeyer, pastor of St. Vincent's Church, Baltimore, and professor in Mount St. Mary's College, Emmitsburg, and in the writings of the Reverend Charles J. White, D.D., Washington City, and in a volume of 148 pages by the Reverend Joseph M. Finotti, recently published by Kelly and Pyatt, Baltimore, 1879. The Reverend Demetrius Galitzin thus verifies his investigation of those strange actions. Quote, in September 1797, I became acquainted with Richard McSherry and his family, and very soon a most intimate friendship was formed between us. I remained in that part of the country, spending time either at home or at Livingston's from September until near Christmas, when I had to return to Conewago, then the place of my residence. My view in coming to Virginia and remaining there 3 months was to investigate those extraordinary facts at Livingston's, of which I could not prevail upon myself to believe, but I was soon converted to a full belief of them. No lawyer in a court of justice did ever examine or cross-examine witnesses more strictly than I did. All those I could procure. I spent several days in penning down the whole account, which, on my return to Conewago, was read with great interest and handed from one to another." Unquote. Livingston removed from Virginia to Cambria County, Pennsylvania, the then residence of Reverend Mr. Galitzin. Before doing so, he conveyed the Clip property trustees for the benefit of the Catholic Church. The house in which those wonders are said to have occurred no longer exists. The present property, belonging to the church, consists of 34 acres of land. Priest's Spring is still shown to strangers, and a small stream passes by the name of Clip Creek. Reverend Demetrius A. Galitzin died in May 1840 at his residence in Cambria County, Pennsylvania, and where there has since grown up a town called Galitzin, on the line of the Pennsylvania Railroad. The memory of that zealous minister of the gospel is held in the deepest reverence in the western part of the state, where he was well known.